Hello guys, welcome back. My name is Nathan, and today we need to talk about some huge new Jack Eichel updates and some big details that have come out since our last Jack Eichel video. Now they're mostly coming from Elliotte Friedman, who on his recent 32 Thoughts podcast put out a ton of new Jack Eichel details on what new teams are involved in the sweepstakes, what trades we could potentially see, and when this trade will actually go down, which is super important. But when it comes to Jack Eichel and all the latest rumors, what is the latest news, what is the latest details, and when could we see a Jack Eichel trade actually happen, and what teams are involved up to this point? Watch till the end for all the details and all the Jack Eichel news, and make sure you hit that subscribe button if you are new. 60% of the people that are watching are not subscribed. If you like hockey, this channel is the place to be. Now, I know I mentioned a few teams in the title and thumbnail and everything that are in on Jack Eichel, but Elliotte Friedman also on that podcast mentioned a ton of other teams that could be in on Jack Eichel and are on him in October 2021 and heading into November as well. Now, one of the big things we've heard from Jack Eichel's camp over the past few days is that they might file a grievance claim to the NHLPA, and Elliotte Friedman also had this story where he said this: "I think that sometime in the next week, 2 weeks max, the sense is I'm getting if there's not a trade or an agreement between the Sabres and the Eichels on his medical path, I think you're going to see Eichel file a grievance to see if he can move things along." And that type of situation was almost not even a consideration just a few months ago, but we got into such a drastic place that Eichel and everybody's considering it. This would be a horrible situation for almost everybody involved, and it seems like, as Elliotte Friedman mentions, an agreement or a trade is probably likely going to happen in the next couple of weeks, 2 weeks at the absolute max. And this article was made a couple of days ago, so the time is ticking for the Buffalo Sabres. And Elliotte Friedman afterwards as well started to point to a ton of NHL teams that are either closing in or closing out of the Jack Eichel sweepstakes. And the first team he mentioned in the entire podcast regarding Jack Eichel was the Vegas Golden Knights. And his quote here is extremely telling to what Vegas is thinking right now and if we could see a potential trade. And Elliotte Friedman said this: "The thing about Vegas, Jeff, is that if you're looking for the help right now, he doesn't help you right now." I think that's kind of what some teams have looked at. And basically what Elliotte Friedman is saying there is that Vegas really doesn't feel too comfortable to make a deal like that, especially in the position they're in. They're 1-4-0 right now. They're already struggling, and you'd also have to give up some more assets on top of them. And NHL Watcher as well makes that same point. Friedman makes a good point. What if you take healthy bodies off the roster for Eichel? You don't have them. You lose the bodies, plus you don't have Stone and Pacioretty. Makes very little sense. So yeah, basically summarizing that Vegas situation we've been talking about for a while when it comes to Jack Eichel, it doesn't seem to make too much sense for Vegas, and they don't want to seem to make that trade as of right now, with Stone and Pacioretty both out of the lineup, and especially Pacioretty potentially longer term, to trade even more bodies on top of that to get Jack Eichel, who probably won't be ready until the end of the season. Doesn't make a ton of sense for Vegas. It would make sense longer term, but for this season, especially if Pacioretty is out as long as we think he can be, then you're basically giving up on the season, especially if you're going to trade a guy like Alex Tuch or maybe an NHL roster defenseman. That is a lot to give up for a Vegas team that has already been pretty decimated due to injury, and having another guy on LTIR basically in Jack Eichel wouldn't exactly help their situation. So it seems like Vegas up to this point is kind of hesitant, cautious, even though they are in on Jack Eichel. It seems like a trade isn't likely to happen, especially since they don't want to give up on paying Krebs, which is pretty much the main piece that Buffalo wants in a Vegas Jack Eichel trade. Now, Friedman also went on the Jeff Merrick show to also point to a few teams that interest him a lot in the Jack Eichel sweepstakes, and this quote was extremely fascinating as well, pointing to a specific team that might also be out on the Jack Eichel situation. And Friedman said this: "The teams I've wondered about with Eichel are Calgary, Vegas. I've heard less about Anaheim than I have heard in the past. Rangers, but again, now they've signed Graviteh, I don't think they can do it without retaining some money." And then he also goes on to point to another team that has been speculated about quite a bit, and Elliotte Friedman's talking about Eichel with the Seattle Kraken. "I haven't heard a ton of it, to be honest. It's not like they can't do it. I mean, I've heard it sprinkled around, but not to the point where I believed anything was close there." So also Friedman not just talking about teams like Calgary and Anaheim and other teams like the Rangers, he's also talking about a team like the Seattle Kraken, who, yes, doesn't seem to be close to a deal at any point, but it seems like even the Seattle Kraken have done their due diligence to try and see what the price might be and try to make a trade happen. It seems like almost every single team is trying to do this, trying to make something happen and trying to make something work. Seattle is no exception in that rule. Now, there are 4 more teams that Elliotte Friedman mentions in this Jeff Merrick show that also could be in on Jack Eichel and could be major players going forward, and I think these 4 teams have massive potential. Now, there's a few interesting names on those 4 teams, but Elliotte Friedman said this on the Jeff Merrick show regarding an Eichel trade. Colorado, we obviously know, has been around in a minor way. There's definitely teams that we are not aware of. So, Elliotte Friedman confirms that there's a ton of teams out there that do have interests that we aren't quite knowing about up to this point, but Colorado, knowing in a minor way that they've been involved in that. We already do know that when it comes to Jack Eichel, Buffalo doesn't want to really retain any salary on that deal, and Colorado want to retain the salary. So unless that changes, it doesn't seem like the Avs are going to be a major player unless that salary retention does come into play. But Elliotte Friedman always mentions a few other teams. I've wondered about teams like Carolina and Columbus, but right now I don't get the sense anyone's close. So very interesting, those 2 teams involved, 2 Metro teams. Columbus is not really too much of a surprise. They're a team that's always kind of been floated around in the Jack Eichel sweepstakes. They're in big need of a top center. Could definitely use a guy of Jack Eichel's skill set. I mean, imagine Eichel with Patrick Laine. That would be insane to watch. But then you have the other team listed here in the Carolina Hurricanes, which would just be absolutely nasty. You could have a top 3 center core, theoretically, of Aho, Eichel, and Trocheck. Now, you might have to give up a Trocheck maybe in a deal like that, but at the same time, Carolina being involved is kind of nuts. But there is one last team that Elliotte Friedman does mention in this podcast, and again, he also goes into some more detail later on, and there is some more stuff to talk about when it comes to Jack Eichel, specifically what trades we could actually see with these teams. But the last team that Elliotte Friedman does mention is the Boston Bruins, and he mentions them in this quote. When it comes to Elliotte Friedman on the Eichel and Bruins fit, he said this: "Well, I think they've been around there. There's no question about that. I just look at Boston's situation and think of what Buffalo wants, and I just wonder if Boston can do it." And I feel like that pretty much puts the nail in the coffin there, or puts the nail on the head when it comes to Eichel's situation with Boston, what we could potentially see there, because really what it comes down to is the asking price, and if Boston's going to actually be able to do it. That's pretty much it. I feel like Boston would be a perfect fit on paper, and Eichel would eventually be the replacement perhaps for Patrice Bergeron on that first line center spot. But Boston isn't exactly a stacked prospect pool right now. They don't exactly have the most assets in the world, and even though there would be players there, guys like Jake DeBrusk, you could probably get rid of maybe a Brandon Carlo, for instance. There is options there, but at the same time, it's definitely not an ideal situation for Buffalo, especially since Boston is in the division, and that's something that they've been stressing a lot, wanting to trade Jack Eichel to the West at the very least, or outside of the division, but trading him to Boston would be the exact opposite of that. Now, let's say Buffalo is okay with potentially trading Eichel to Boston within the same division. I still think there could be a trade that actually happens involving some of the young assets that Boston has, especially after this past 2021 draft. Now, I feel like the main trade here when it comes to Boston and Eichel would definitely revolve around the 2022 first and Fabian Lysell, who I thought was a great pick for the Bruins in the first round last year. It would revolve around those 2 guys, probably a guy like Jake DeBrusk on top of that. You could maybe have a guy like Brandon Carlo, but you could probably afford to get away with maybe a defenseman like Jacob Zboril, who's still pretty young and does have some talent there. You could also maybe add Jack Studnicka on top of that too. The Bruins have some pretty good young talents still in the system that hasn't really panned out up to this point, but the Sabres are looking for as much as humanly possible, and I feel like the Bruins are willing to give up a lot of those young assets. It could work out. They could even give up the second rounder from last year, Mason Lowry, potentially in this trade, who has developed pretty well under their system. I feel like Boston has a couple of really good options in an Eichel trade, and if, again, the Sabres are willing to look past the division aspect, I feel like there is a trade that could actually happen here. Now, I went back to the Carolina Hurricanes to see what potential trades could be made, and I'm kind of going against the Vincent Trocheck idea just because he has 1 year left, and I feel like Buffalo will want to go for a more long-term deal, and I think Brady Shea as the best NHL player in that deal would make sense. 4 years left at $5.2 million, and he's a guy that can stay in Buffalo and be under that contract, and Buffalo can keep for quite a while, but I think that'll be the best option. I think Carolina is also one of those teams that is potentially willing to give up 2 first-round picks. They're going to be fantastic, and if Jack Eichel does play, they're going to be terrific, especially if they're not giving up a guy like Vincent Trocheck, who is still a big part of that team. But I feel like with Carolina, it would revolve around maybe 2 first-round picks, Brady Shea, and you could also put on a couple of other prospects on top of that. Maybe you don't trade Jake Bean because you are trading Shea. Maybe there is a roster spot open because of that, but potentially a guy like Ryan Suzuki, who is looking good, but isn't looking like a cornerstone for the Canes, could be a part of the deal like that. You could also have prospects like Dominic Bach on top of it. maybe a Ronan Seeley, maybe a Joey Keane. There's some really good potential options for Carolina in this trade, and I feel like with the just depth of prospects they have, Buffalo would still be open to trading for him, especially if guys like Ryan Suzuki and other top prospects are on top of that deal. Now, I gotta admit something, I completely forgot that Jake Bean was on Columbus, and that's a great segue onto the next team that I think could have a pretty interesting trade package for Eichel in the Columbus Blue Jackets, who have been another team that was mentioned thoroughly by Elliotte Friedman, but also by pretty much everybody over the past few weeks as a great potential option for Jack Eichel. Now, they're definitely kind of the opposite of Carolina, where they might not be willing to even give up one first-round pick, but if they do, I do think Columbus would have a pretty good advantage there. I could see them giving up a first-round pick, maybe Cole Sillinger, and probably not having maybe too much on top of it. You could probably have a first-round pick, Cole Sillinger, maybe a Jonas Korpisalo as a goaltender there, and maybe another guy on top of that, potentially like an Alex Texier. I think that could be actually a pretty good blueprint for the Buffalo Sabres, and they might want something on top of that, because I don't think Sillinger is going to be the elite of the elite, but I still think he's going to be a really good prospect and is already in the NHL, which is a fantastic sign. But there's some great talent there to work with for Buffalo, and Columbus might not be a team that actually makes the playoffs this year, and could be a lottery team too, so you'd also be getting a lottery pick potentially on top of that. But if Columbus does make this deal, I think it would probably be later on potentially, especially if they continue to play the way they have. I don't think they'd want to give up a top 5 pick whatsoever. That's not in the cards for them right now. But if Buffalo does make a deal, I think Columbus would be a pretty wise team to trade with. And for Columbus, getting a guy like Jack Eichel, that true #1 center, would be brilliant. Again, with Patrick Laine, they would be unstoppable on that power play. Now, I do want to say, as of right now, I think like Carolina, Columbus, and even a team like Boston might be the frontrunners for Jack Eichel. It seems like, again, Colorado doesn't want to make a deal unless there's a retained salary there. And on top of that, teams like Vegas aren't really in the position to make that trade either. So I feel like there's real potential for this trade to happen out east. And again, Elliotte Friedman also said earlier that the Anaheim Ducks have kind of left a little bit in terms of their interest, and the LA Kings, another team that in the West, was left in their interest a long time ago as well. So it seems like it's more and more, it's more likely that this trade will end up happening in the East, and I feel like that's pretty exciting to what we could actually see. That opens up a ton more opportunities and a ton more teams, but I feel like Columbus and Carolina might be the two most interesting teams in this situation, and would still have a lot to give the Buffalo Sabres if a trade were to happen. But it seems like we're finally getting some good progress on the Jack Eichel front, pretty much just because of Jack Eichel alone trying to single-handedly force a trade out of the Buffalo Sabres system, but it seems like we will see the situation resolve itself over the next couple weeks, whether it be because of Jack Eichel's grievance filing or anything. It doesn't seem like a single trade is extremely close right now as of this instant, but that can change, of course, with how many teams are involved and how much potential there is. I feel like we will see a trade, hopefully, within the next couple of weeks, but it seems like this situation is getting crazier and crazier as the days go by. It seems like a lot of teams, though, are, again, trying their darndest to make a trade happen and to get a guy like that, $10 million during the season, which is hard enough to do already. But Jack Eichel is going to be a fantastic player for whoever he ends up playing for, but it seems like the situation is finally going to come to a close eventually, which I know we've been saying that for a year, but let's hope it actually happens this time. But that'll be it for today, guys. Thank you so much for watching. If you guys did enjoy, make sure you hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and hit that notification bell if you haven't already. Comment down below, what do you guys think of the new Jack Eichel trade rumors? What teams do you think are the most likely to trade for Jack Eichel? Who do you think trades for Jack Eichel? And what do your mock trades actually look like? Can your favorite team trade for him? Let me know your mock trades there as well. Make sure you comment all your thoughts. Make sure you share this video with your friends. Get it out there to any hockey fans you know, any trade rumor fans you guys know as well. And click on this card for all the NHL trade rumor content right in one bingeable playlist. My name is Nathan. Have a fantastic day, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.